is my honor today to introduce our guest speaker. He also comes to us, as did another recent speaker, via our connection with Christian Hayden, who is a leader in training in the American Ethical Union. Evan Nabrit is an artist and designer based in West Philadelphia, although he's coming to us from Ohio today. His work mainly lampoons American power, typically involves attenuated figure and ground relationships, and is informed by a long-standing collage practice, drawing largely from commercial and fashion photography, cartoons, and history painting. A 2012 to 14 Heidelberg Fellow and Dean's Diversity Scholar, Nabrit received his interdisciplinary MFA from the Weitzman School of Design, University of Pennsylvania, in 2014. He was a graduate lecture fellow with the ICA Philadelphia, as well as a 2013 visiting or teaching fellow in the Department of Visual Studies in the School of Arts and Sciences at Penn. He holds a BA cum laude from Amherst College, 2006. Nabrit currently works as a graphic designer with an AEI firm in Philadelphia. In 2022, he composed a book of studio images and institutional critique, which he called Status as Material Post-Media Realism, which was based on his graduate studies. Our theme this month is Nurturing Beauty, and Evan is going to speak to us on beauty, nurturing, and durational practice. So go ahead, Evan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. Um, I wanted to extend a special thanks to Christian for inviting me, and to Joan and to Billy for helping me today get set up and acclimated to our conversation today. So to begin, I wanted to start by looking at some different notions of beauty. I'm going to share my screen. I have a short presentation I'd like to share. Just give me one moment. So I wanted to talk today about beauty, nurturing, and durational practice. I wanted to begin by looking at different notions of beauty, political, ethical implications of standardizing beauty, and ultimately, I would like for us to consider beauty in an expanded sense. Um, and I'd like for us to center the idea of beauty as an encounter, at which point I think nurturing and durational practice should come into focus. So on beauty, I wanted to start with these two quotes. When I was first preparing for this talk, I I was surprised that Christian had asked me to speak on beauty specifically because so often in my work, my treatment of beauty is political and not metaphysical. And I have like all these different ideas about what beauty might mean. And so in researching, I began to look to thinkers that maybe could give me some sense of guidance. Um, I knew that Toni Morrison had written extensively on notions of goodness, goodness in literature, and in the role of evil in literature and its centrality. So I started there and I found these two quotes. These are contrasting quotes across time, speaking to beauty, first in the sense of the sort of politics of beauty, the way that beauty can cause subjection and tyranny through its standardization. And then the second is an excerpt wherein she's talking about beauty in terms of how it relates to her practice as a writer, as a storyteller, as a maker of ideas and art. So in this secondary quote, she talks a lot about the sort of transcendental idea about beauty, which is something that she makes akin to the other transcendentals of knowledge, truth, beauty. And she talks about it as being essential, as a state of being, essentially. And while I think this is the more productive space for us to begin our conversation about beauty and nurturing beauty in durational practice, I do think that the other conception of beauty, beauty as a tyrannical form, does deserve mentioning. Excuse me. So when we think about this other form of beauty, this political beauty, and we ask ourselves, what is beauty and who gets to say? I think that we find ourselves locked in a kind of tyranny of beauty. But with this expanded notion of beauty as something that is a sort of state of being, I think this enables us to think about beauty in ways that are more um, fulfilling for us, that give us more meaning. So, like I said, I think it's the better posture. Um, but this other type of beauty that is political is also informative. Um, so the difficulty here is that we have these contrasting ideas of what beauty is, and beauty can mean different things for different people. And it has meant different things for different people. We could solve for beauty as beauty could be X. You might think beauty is this, I might think beauty is that. But the idea of nurturing beauty is something that is a little bit more defined. So I think that the idea of nurturing is about care and time. And I think that how the artist relates to beauty has a relationship to nurturing. I think that if beauty is a state of being, then there are more ways of us to discuss it than simply the sort of constraints of beauty and the standards of beauty that inform, for example, hiring practices. I just saw this film, this documentary this weekend about the hiring practices of Abercrombie and Fitch. And explicitly in their practices, there was a standard of who's beautiful and who is not. And who is beautiful would be hired, who is not beautiful would not be hired, they would be fired. And the idea of nurturing that as a standardized beauty is something that is, I think, politically dangerous, ethically fraught, but is a common practice. And I think that before getting into broader metaphysical notions of beauty, I think that we do need to spend a bit of time talking about that political beauty. So this brings us to the prompt. When I was preparing for this talk and I was thinking about what the prompt, one of the quotes that was offered in Nurturing Beauty was from Pascal saying, in difficult times, carry something beautiful in your heart. And I thought about this in relationship to the difficult time of the early days of the pandemic, when social isolation as a practice was widespread. And for me, I began looking more and more at quality of life questions. I started buying flowers, cut flowers, and I started eating dark chocolate and buying colognes and perfumes and sensory things that could sort of help me in this difficult time through their beauty. And I gathered those things, and among those things was a durational practice that I returned to from my early childhood, which was watercolors. So when I was a young boy, my mother tells a story. I was painting, and I came to her with this is fitting because it's Mother's Day. I came to her with this picture, a picture of a swan. The swan was then reflected in the water, and I was about 3, and she was really upset by that. She didn't know what was going on. She called my dad and said that, at work, and thought that maybe I was having some kind of an episode, and she was very concerned. When they realized that this was just an artistic expression that was just manifesting early in childhood, they made a decision to nurture that. And when I think about the beauty of that decision and the encounter between a loving family and this new emergent practice, and what the decision is for that group, for that family, that community, to do with that, and whether they will nurture it, whether they will discourage it. Um, and it reminds me also of the ways in which beauty can be explicitly gendered. I know that when I was a young person, a child growing up, that things that were beautiful were not for boys. And I remember as a kid, my parents nurturing all of my creative pursuits in all the ways in which that I was identifying and pursuing beauty. They would nurture that. And so, for example, um, in I was about 10, I was working with a ballet company, and I was asked to uh, consider joining their pre-professional program. And the issue with that was that there would be a increase in the number of practices. And because of that increase in practices, I would need to make a decision about whether or not I was going to continue the Saturday art program that I was attending at the time, or if I was going to stop doing that and pursue ballet as a pre-professional. So my father and mother um, talked to me candidly about this and told me that this choice would be mine to make, and that whatever decision was that I chose, um, I would need to make that commitment and keep that commitment. And as a young child, thinking about the respectfulness of that encounter, um, there was something quite beautiful about that. And as I think about it as an adult, and I return to that as an adult, I think about the ways in which my pursuit of beauty bumped up against norms about gender and gender expression, and the ways in which those things are to a degree taboo. And regardless of that, my family allowed me to nurture those things. So flash forward to um, the pandemic, and I'm looking for practices that I can reach back and return to in a sort of Sankofa idea of durational practice. Um, so let's pause and think about what a durational practice is. I think oftentimes when we think durational practice, I think people think of performance art. They think of Mariana Abramovic. Excuse me, I mispronounced that. But they think about these sorts of stamina performances that are about endurance. And while endurance might be included, I think that the encounter with beauty could be centered as a durational practice. And it could take a multiplicity of forms. It could be someone who quilts and has quilted in their entire life, and in times of difficulty or in times of meditative moments at junctures, critical junctures, unimportant junctures in life, insignificant ones, they return to these sorts of set encounters, these sets of practices. And these sets of practices are able to, depending on usage, allow us to recenter where we are in the world, especially particularly during difficult times. So I found myself returning to watercolor in a way that became exceptionally productive for me, as a way of, by means of nurturing this durational practice. What ended up happening was I was able to return to and resolve some difficulties, some hurt, and some grief that had sort of put distance between me and this practice since childhood to adulthood. One of those things being, um, during graduate school, I had used watercolors as a means of getting into graduate school. My portfolio was 90% watercolors. But once I got there, I wanted to move away a bit and experiment and try to stretch out a bit. So I put away the sort of durational practices of my youth and took on some other things, and then was suddenly hit with a series of deaths. And I found myself in a extended period of grief. And I didn't return to my extended practice. I found myself alienated from it, in fact. And when the pandemic happened, I had just started to come out of that extended period. And I was looking for these comforts and these sorts of buoys in life. And I found the watercolor practice sitting there waiting for me. So I started there, and I got back into a rhythm. And through that rhythm, I was able to, like I said, resolve some of the things that I had to leave at graduate school, I was able to come back to them again, and I was able to compile them into a collection of institutional critiques and studio works that we discussed at the outset. Um, this was a sort of unexpected result of returning to a durational practice, and it was an unexpected sort of healing that I found myself moving through. So some of the key takeaways I think for us today are, what are some ways in which being intentional about beauty can add richness to our lives in some ways that are expected, in some ways that are not expected, individually and also in community. And can nurturing beauty individually through a durational practice, can that provide us with deeper and more meaningful care when we are with each other and when we are together? And what are some ways in which being intentional about durational practice, how might those help us center beauty as a metaphysical encounter? So those are some of my thoughts today about beauty and durational practice. Thank you for listening.